So I am thinking this evening about a topic that is very common for me to reflect upon. The topic of dreaming and imagination. In the word imagination, there are phonemes, right? Like the word image begins the word imagination. And it's a verb if we think of it as an action, and it's a noun if we think of it as a thing. Or perhaps, it's a verb if we think of it as a process or something one does. It's a noun if we think of it as something that can be pointed to. We can point at it with language. I suspect that each person's dreaming activity is as unique as it is similar to the dreaming activity of others. But there are many astonishing questions associated with this thing that most of us are doing each night while we sleep. And some of us have very good dream recollection, and some of us don't. And some of us have dreams and dream themes that repeat very commonly, and some of us don't. Some people have dreams that vary in their thematic content regularly, and other people have certain themes that recur. And it's not just people, it's times of life and situations we may be in, both in our lives and emotions, and also our psyche, if we want to use this term. We have variance then over our lifespan and circumstances and health situations and so on. So our dreaming experience will vary over time for nearly everyone. And we have, in the West anyway, a variety of beliefs and common suppositions and narratives about dreaming. And other cultures have other unique or different ideas and suppositions about dreaming. There are cultures in which it is proposed that there is a specific aspect of the soul that is involved in dreaming. There are cultures and traditions that propose that dreaming is preparation, in a sense kind of practice for something, for various things maybe, one of which could be death. So there's all these different perspectives and ideas and narratives available to those of us who are interested in dreaming. But perhaps the most important thing, or something that at least stands out to my attention, is our uniquely personal dream experience. And perhaps what we make of it and how we relate with that experience is likely to transform it. If we pay very close attention to our dreaming, if we keep dream journals, and so on, this naturally transforms what our dreaming experience will be, because it seems to me that when and how and for what purposes we pay attention to our own dreaming affects the dreaming process very profoundly. Not all of us have learned to remember dreams, and I would suggest that what we actually remember is not a dream at all. I have good reason to suspect this. I also think that the temporality of a dream, in other words, the amount of time that it takes to have a dream, is very small compared to the subjective experience of the passage of time, both in the dream and when we try to recall it. But one of the things that happens for most of us when we recall a dream is very peculiar. And that is that the dream's intrinsic dimensionality. Let me explain what I mean here. While we are awake, identity has a relatively limited number of domains of meaningful content. And when we are dreaming, this transforms, in my experience, quite dramatically, so that our experience of identity, whether it's our identity or the identity of others and such, or situations, objects, circumstances, transforms dramatically so that things, beings, and relationships and processes get extra dimensions of meaning that they're very unlikely to ordinarily have while we are awake. And I find this really profound and peculiar and beautiful and astonishing. Because if we are lucky, we may have an experience while we are awake that is similar in that something relatively ordinary, as if there is any such thing. Perhaps our waking mind ordinarializes our experience, right? It normalizes it. Whereas our dreaming mind it doesn't always, but it's capable of doing the opposite. It non-ordinarializes identity and meaning and relation and so on. And this is very profound. So one of the things that happens when most of us anyway, when we claim to remember a dream, and if there's anyone listening who this doesn't happen for, I would very much like to hear about that. We don't really remember the dream, right? What happens is our waking mind produces a schema from the dream, and the schema is kind of skeletal. Essentially what we get is the skeleton that you might in film or writing call a plot. So usually when we say we remember a dream, what we mean is something like we derive a plot from a memory, an array of memories.
Someone posted on Reddit today.
And the plot is a sequence of events. And it's really not like a dream, because dreaming has this peculiar quality of timelessness or of being outside of time, almost as if each moment of the dreaming experience influences all the other moments while they are emerging into consciousness, while we are experiencing them. You could imagine this as a triangle whose top point is a unification of all the moments of a dream, and whose lower horizontal line is the seeming appearance of sequence. And the reason that I say seeming appearance is that when we have a really intimate experience of dreaming, we may discover that the waking mind's reliance on linear sequentiality is an illusion, especially when it comes to dreaming. Quite possibly when it comes to life too. We're kind of stuck, most of us, most of the time, in a linear perspective of time. I don't think there's reason to rationally believe in that, right? But I don't think there's much reason to believe that that's the true nature of what's actually going on during our lifetimes. I think that may be an artifact of the common way we are trained to relate with temporality. And there are many other ways and experiences of temporality that we are capable of having, but few of us will be either in contexts or in, how shall I put this, states of consciousness, forms of consciousness that grant us access to non-linear experiences of time. Dreaming is, I think, at least potentially one of those unique ways, unique situations in which we can experience non-linear time. Now, I've had relatively unusual dreaming experience, and I think many people have at least some standout, unusual dreaming experience at some point throughout their life. Some people have it very commonly, some others very rarely, some others at only certain life phases or in certain situations, and so on. There are all kinds of different dreaming phenomenon. I always get confused between the singular and the plural of this word phenomenon. And in the West, we have narratives, that are common to our culture and discussion of dreaming, and ideas about dreaming, many of which are dismissive, I think, of the profound and actually miraculous nature of this phenomenon, because, well, what we can get from research and science will necessarily be very limited in terms of its capacity to come to terms with the phenomena of dreaming. It appears that dreaming underlies many conscious abilities and is deeply linked to our capacity to learn and remember, and maybe even to control the temperature of our bodies, according to research. So some research has given us insight into how fundamentally important dreaming is, but it can't really tell us much about meaning. Yeah? Or, well, let us just say that statistical analysis, dissection, anatomical narratives, this part, that part, and so on, these have only a relatively limited domain of usefulness compared to the power of the experience itself. And there are so many aspects of this that I'll probably speak on it many times. But there's a few things that I have the urge to reflect upon today. I've been very curious about dreaming since I was a child, and I realized relatively early on that there are different modes of dreaming. There's a kind of ordinary mode, which is perhaps the most common experience for many of us. But there are also what I would call big dreams. Poor nomenclature. But a big dream is the kind of a dream that's deeply and profoundly significant, often fantastical or exotic or very deeply emotionally affecting. And we may have some number of these throughout our lives, our lifetimes. I've had, that I can recall, something like 12 or 13 of these at my present age. And they were more common when I was younger. I think particularly in my 20s, I would have great dreams with more frequency, and also other relatively exotic dream phenomenon. Of course, exotic is, the reason I say relatively exotic is that what comprises an exotic experience depends on the individual and their, sort of timeline, or however you want to think about the progression of their dreaming experience. Some people have very exotic dreaming, relatively exotic dreaming experience quite frequently. Others have it relatively rarely. An exotic dreaming experience might, for some people, be, for example, lucid dreaming, which I think of as the gentle intrusion of the waking consciousness into the manifold-like structure of a dream. Now, ordinarily, when waking consciousness begins to intrude on the dreaming landscape or environment or process, this manifold collapses and we wake up, right? And sometimes a question in the dream precedes that, and often a question is kind of the strange antithesis of a dream. Not always, but it can be. So I could find myself in a situation where, for example, I encounter my sister, but she is male. Now, in ordinary dreaming, I will not necessarily question that, right? I may notice something is unusual about my sister, but I will not ask myself the specific question, why is my sister a man today? And if I do, that sort of waking mind relationship with identity could cause the dream to collapse. This is one way of thinking about it anyway, one way of speaking about how I think of it. And I will awaken. I will awaken because I formed a question of a particular kind. Now, often what happens when I form a question in a dream like this is that the dream backfills. It will create a sort of makeshift explanation, which is really kind of the wrong word, but it's similar to an explanation, that convinces me that the question is unimportant and I can continue dreaming. All of this language is very provisional, however, because whatever it is that's going on in dreaming, it doesn't have usually a lot to do with language, or at least not in the way we're ordinarily used to thinking about topics linguistically and in nomenclature. There are many unusual features of even relatively ordinary dreams that are important, but one of the things that many people are interested in is what we call lucid dreaming, which is where there's some degree of awareness that one is dreaming, and perhaps some degree of conscious ability to modulate the context and situation of the dream. And that is a really fascinating phenomena, but without wanting to discount or dismiss it, there are many other aspects of dreaming that I think we would be well rewarded for paying deep attention to. And the intrusion of conscious control can become a kind of, what's the right word? Well, we can become fascinated with this particular thing in ways that can limit some of the other astonishing features of dreaming in our relationship with it that I consider to be beautiful and important to explore. Again, this isn't to dismiss the usefulness or profundity of being lucid within dreaming. I think there's something very astonishing there. And sometimes this is rather ordinary. We're just kind of floating between being awake and dreaming. And other times it's very non-ordinary. We're deep in a dream, in the dreaming state, and lucidity arises and just radically transforms what's going on, the nature of the context, and can produce, flying and astonishing transformations of the experienced environment and so on and so forth. I have so many questions about dreaming. So many questions. And some of them I've carried my entire lifetime. But back to the sort of exotic aspects of dreaming. We have lucid dreaming. And there's a vast range of forms of lucidity, forms of being aware in dreaming. Then we have phenomenon like sleep paralysis, which are often very terrifying and seem to differ at least slightly between men and women, to commonly differ in how they experience this. Again, there are many features that are unique to individuals or situations or circumstances in both lucidity and in sleep paralysis. And then we have two other things, or at least two names for other things. We have what people refer to as out-of-body experiences, where it seems their essence leaves their body and goes on some kind of an adventure. And then we have another thing that might be the same thing sometimes. We can't really know because there's no way to get a clear grip on these phenomenon. But we have what some people refer to as astral travel, which is the experience of being in non-physical dimensions or domains. And there are other experiences of dreaming that we don't have categories for. We don't have names for them. And I would ask that we be careful about trusting the names too much. Yeah? It's okay to have provisional categories. And actually, it's okay to do whatever feels natural to you in exploring these matters. No one can tell us what we're supposed to do or what we should do or so on and so forth. This is a deeply, intimately personal aspect of our human experience. But there are many other potentials, possibilities, and opportunities associated with dreaming that I think very few of us will be likely to encounter. And a primary part of the reason why it is unlikely is that we've been told stories about dreaming by people who we consider to be authorities. And those stories are very compelling. Yeah? Once we believe someone to be an authority, we are likely to take what they say very seriously and change our ideas about what's possible and not, what's meaningful and not, so on and so forth. Now, this morning, while I was dreaming, I first dreamt about I had an experience that I find rather surprising upon reflecting on it. I first dreamt that I was in a very busy computer store helping a lot of different people who had suddenly shown up where a little while before there was nobody, for someone I work for. And that transformed into being in a hospital and helping people in a medical environment get treatment and so on. And when I awoke, I had received an email from someone I work for related to building a computational interface to help people in a medical context. Now, one could imagine that there's no connection there, but it seems pretty unlikely. I'm not making the hard claim of telepathy, but I'm saying our dreaming mind, if we want to speak of it this way, has natural abilities and affinities that we would be likely, most of us, many of us, to doubt the believability of with our ordinary rational conscious mind. Yeah. And yet we can have direct experience of these things just as I've had today. And I am not particularly surprised by this, because without needing to have a narratological explanation, right? I don't have to have a story or an explanation of what's going on to have an experience of it. And the dreaming mind doesn't care much about explanations or stories really anyway. It's more about intimacy and direct experience and transformation and relationship and emotion and new dimensions of identity and meaning and relation and process and so on than it is about explanations, which, by the way, is a word that means to flatten, right? To explain something is to flatten it. And when you flatten a dream, you get something a lot like the waking mind. In fact, the plot that we remember when we say I can remember a dream is, in a way, a flattening, yeah, of that dreaming experience. It's not even really the skeleton of a dream. And I think if we could truly remember a dream, we would have to start dreaming, right? We would re-dream the dream, and it would not seem like a plot. There are so many features of dreaming that are astonishing. For example, I think many of us would believe that we have conversations in dreams, yet when we are able to be very clearly aware of what's happening in dreaming, it's unlikely that we are doing something that is the analog of speaking. There's something else going on. And I've had situations where I was trying to speak very clearly or even to yell at somebody in a dream who I'm angry at, and it was extremely difficult to make the things come out. Like, it was garbled. And I've had other situations where, for example, I will ask someone their name and they will reply, but it's garbled. And I'll ask them 2 or 3 times. I'll say, I couldn't quite hear you. Could you say that again? And it's still garbled. Now, I'm not claiming, again, that everyone has the same experience. I think it's important to realize we're each unique dreamers, even though perhaps most of us dream. Now, we would normally, in common language, we would say that we see things in dreams. But how is it that you see things when your eyes are not open? What are you seeing? Right? So this is a similar thing where we think that we are using a faculty common to our waking experience, and yet something very different from our waking experience is going on. And it's possible to have the experience of light and darkness in dreaming, but where does the light in dreams come from? And of course, it's not truly light, is it? We might more reasonably refer to it as illumination. But in our dreaming, there is an analog of sight or vision, and there is an analog of light or darkness, and there is some kind of analog of communication, whether or not it's precisely verbal. A friend of mine who's a neuroscientist and who's interested in dreams but doesn't really like to talk about them much for reasons, he just doesn't believe that the waking mind is capable of meaningfully talking about dreaming, along with other ideas that he has, some of which are very interesting. But he was one of the first people to suggest to me that whatever it is that's going on in dreaming that we think of as speaking with other people, or the semblance of speaking with other people, is not actually language at all. And that dreaming and language are kind of two polarities that don't go together well. And while I think his objections are fascinating and important, I think they're also incomplete. There is something like speaking that happens in dreaming sometimes, and there is something like vision that happens in dreaming, but we're not seeing, right? I've also had unusual experiences where, for example, I believed that I awoke, looked around my room, saw things in the room in the places that they actually are, including, for example, someone sleeping next to me, had suddenly a strange feeling of something's very unusual here, a feeling that was startling and deep and profound, realized then that my eyes were closed, opened them, and nothing visually changed. Which seems to imply that my consciousness was seeing the room I was in correctly without my eyes. And I very much suspect this to be a capacity of some aspect of our awareness. And there are spiritual traditions and other traditions, meditative traditions, in which such things are talked about. In fact, people have spoken about being able to see everything around us, like having 360-degree vision. All of these things are fascinating because they imply things about the nature of our humanity and our being in awareness that would not ordinarily occur to us in our everyday common cultural contexts. There's also the danger that we will be, what's the right word? That we will be enchanted by models and narratives and claims of people who want us to believe something about the nature of dreaming or consciousness or awareness or our souls or something like this. Some of these narratives are incredibly compelling, and when we become fascinated by dreaming, we are vulnerable. Yeah? We are vulnerable to the narratives of others. I am fascinated by the explorations of people like, I think, Robert Monroe and others who've explored lucid dreaming, out-of-body, what we call out-of-body experiences, what we refer to as astral travel, and so on. I find all of these things compelling and beautiful and interesting to explore, but I don't want them to replace the authentic, intimately personal nature of my own relationship and questions with dreaming. And I encourage you to preserve that aspect of your own fascination and curiosity and interest above. Hold that above all the narratives. Yeah? Let that thing have the place of authority and allow the narratives to subsist or be useful in a more limited way, so that they don't overtake the entire terrain, right? Because this is a common problem for us. We'll hear a story, we believe the story, we become fascinated by the story, and then generally we're going to probably just live it out. When we might have had many other opportunities that were amazing and deserve, are crucial to preserve. Yeah, we should preserve degrees of liberty in the adventures that we have, where we're attempting to understand something about the essence of our minds, and particularly our dreaming minds. You know, I don't really recall ever seeing the sun in a dream. And I don't really recall ever seeing a light in a dream. I have a memory of seeing stars in a dream, once at least, and they began to move as I observed them, and I was sitting next to a woman who I have some idea who she might be. I was sitting next to a woman and I saw the stars in a dream, and the stars began to move and to kind of dance in front of me. And I turned to the woman next to me and I said, did you see that? And she just smiled at me with this incredibly luminous smile and didn't really answer. So my hope is that these reflections will encourage you to explore your own dreaming experience with a sense of wonder and adventure and curiosity and amazement and reverence and maybe even adoration, because our dreaming experience is profoundly important to our life as human beings. And it represents a context so powerful that it can deeply inform and transform the nature of our waking experience, opportunities, and potentials as human beings. Our dreaming minds are amenable to a kind of conversation as well, so that you can ask your dreaming mind a question, or you can speak with your dreaming mind just as you might speak with something like the child within yourself, or the adult within yourself, or the parent within yourself. All of these are analogies, of course. But your dreaming mind is amenable to being recognized by your waking consciousness and conversed with. And I would suggest that if you wish to speak with your dreaming mind, or ask it a question, or ask something of it, that you move your consciousness down in deep into your belly and speak from down in your belly. Yeah. Because for some reason, the dreaming mind seems to me to be intimately related with our gut and our digestive processes and our organs in our torsos, rather than being a thing that largely happens in our heads, the way most of us probably experience our waking consciousness. Yeah. There's one last thing that I'll mention before I begin to wrap up here for tonight. And that is that dreaming is a bit like a reflection. The reflection of something on something else. And I'm not sure what the something is, or what the medium that is reflecting is, but this analogy is very profound and can be useful in trying to more deeply understand and experience the potentials and opportunities that dreaming brings into our lives. I encourage you to contact the aspect of your human essence, awareness, consciousness that is deeply involved in dreaming. It is possible to have this consciousness with us when we are awake, and this consciousness has abilities that I think we would be very unlikely to believe in were we not to directly experience them. And some of these are opportunities that are essential to our healthy and wholesome humanity. Perhaps we have dreamed together a little bit while we've explored this topic, while I've been reflecting on this topic together with you. I'm very grateful for those of you who've joined me, and would love to hear your comments, questions, or experiences, so please feel free, if you wish, to share them. I can see Venus high in the evening sky, and The moon is nearing her fullness this January of 2020. May your dreams be profound, beautiful, educational, liberating, and joyous. Bye-bye for now.